Hello everyone. So in this video, we're going to talk about responsive design. We'll go look at a real example of responsive design on the web, talk a little bit about how responsive design helps us design websites that work no matter what type of device we're viewing them on, and then explore a couple different approaches to responsive design, ways to make our layout fluid and ways to adapt them to different viewing conditions. We'll look at the at media style rule and see how we can use that to create these different blocks of CSS for each different device that we might have when we are browsing our website. So let's start by looking at the MDN web docs page. This is my favorite example of responsive design. They do it really well, and it's hopefully at this point a website that you are already familiar with. So on this page here, we can see it's a pretty busy layout by default. If I look up top, there's this nice drop-down navigation menu. On the left, we've got a table of contents for our page. There's all of the main content area of our article here. And then on the right, we've got a sidebar with an advertisement and a in-document table of contents that lets us zip around inside the same page. Watch what happens if I change the size of this window. As I start to shrink this, notice what just happened? That sidebar that was on the right suddenly jumped over to the left. We went from having a 3-column layout to having just 2 columns. A combined navigation menu and add here on the left. And then actually some of those guides that we saw before are just completely gone. We no longer have this nice helpful list of links. If I shrink it even more, it happens again. Notice that menu that was up top suddenly is now a modal pop-up. You click this and a sidebar scrolls down. It's now vertical, and I click on each of these guides to open or close them. And that table of contents is just gone completely. Now there is just one single scroll of content. If I do want to view that table of contents, I can pull it up, and it is a sliding nav bar that extends in and out, kind of fades out the content behind it and shows us our list of options here on the left. I can retract it back, and now I've got just this single column of content here. So this is a perfect example of a technique called responsive design. The goal of responsive design is to make sure that our website remains viewable no matter what type of device we're viewing it on. The main consideration for this is the screen size, because in modern web development, people may be accessing your device on a 30-inch monitor, or they might be looking in the palm of their hand at a mobile device. So your job becomes finding ways to still share all of your relevant content without overwhelming the user or shrinking things down to the size that they are unreadable. So now I want to look at how we could design something similar to this ourselves. So let's start by having some basic website set up. The HTML is the same as we've been doing every one of these videos. I'm going to say in my site, my left content's going to be some nav bar with some elements. In the center, I'll have some article with a bunch of text in paragraphs, maybe a couple images thrown in, and then I'm going to have an aside on the right. So by default, if I wanted a 3-column layout, the tool I might reach for would be a grid. So my main content area, maybe I choose to make a grid with 3 columns using our grid template columns from the last video. Here I say, well, my nav bar will take up a little bit of space on the right. My aside will take up a little bit on the left, and my aside will be on the right. Content here in the center. And you can see I've defined everything here numerically. I have used that one other trick I mentioned last video, where to actually position these things rather than worrying about which column is which number. I've used grid template areas to give them names and then say, well, the nav goes into the sidebar area, the article goes into the main text. And this basically just lets us give names instead of numbers for these three columns, but otherwise it works just like if we use numbers. So now let's take a look at what this website looks like right now. If I cut back over to my browser, we can see it looks about the same as MDN. We've got our table of contents here on this side. I can click to scan up and down, although it all fits on one page. On the right, we've got our little add a sidebar here. It looks pretty good right now. But watch what happens when I try to shrink this web page. As I click and drag, it cuts off the content. The content just flows off to the right. I actually get a scroll bar so I can scroll left and right. So the big mistake that we've made here, the thing that makes this design unresponsive, is the use of absolute unit of measures. So pixel is kind of a funny unit of measure. It's funny in the sense that a pixel doesn't always mean the same thing. If I am on a very low resolution display, a pixel takes up a large amount of space. If I'm on a full high def or 4K display, that same unit of measure is going to be a very, very small amount of space. So what this means is pixels are generally not ideal if we have some vision of what our website's going to look like. It'll make sure things are always proportional to each other. Like if this image takes up 200 pixels and the width of this entire thing is 1,000, I know it's 20%, but I might be better served using units that respect the size of the viewport or are proportional to the thing that they are in themselves. So one simple change I could make to make my website a little bit more responsive is, instead of specifying everything here by pixels, I might instead say, well, you know what? My grid template columns, they're not going to be this length, that length, and that length. Instead, I'm going to use those fractional units to say, well, the nav bar is about 1/3 the size of the center area, and the sidebar is just shy even of that. Now, I am not specifying absolute sizes. I'm specifying units that will scale, grow as the window becomes larger, shrink as it becomes smaller. Similarly, I might say, well, the width of my entire main content area, maybe that is 80% of that view width, that viewport, saying it should take up about 80% of the browser. I can even use text. Text is going to be proportional to the device size. I can still use EMs to say how much space should be between each of these columns. So if I make just that one simple change, if I cut back over and refresh my page, you can see we still have pretty much the same design here. Maybe the measurements have shifted a little bit, but now watch what happens as I grow and shrink the screen. Now, instead of my content just flowing off the right-hand side, instead it actually adjusts and things become a little bit narrower. If I stretch it out again, they become a little bit wider. This is a much more responsive design. Specifically, it's responsive using a technique known as fluid design. So here, our content is fluid in the sense that it behaves almost like water. As our container of our content grows or shrinks, it pours in like liquid and fills in whatever space is there. We can see the text starts to automatically wrap around this image. The margins on the left and right grow and shrink. The actual content area, we still have this similar perception of space, even though the content itself has a different amount of room to work with. So fluid design is that practice of trying to make your design just adapt to sizes without changing a lot. There are many different techniques you can use here. A lot of people do like using some type of grid system and defining all of their grid proportions fractionally using some ratio. This is the technique that a lot of UI libraries like Bootstrap and React use. They'll actually give you a whole bunch of CSS classes that specify where in this grid things should start and stop, and then you just pin those CSS classes onto things and they know where they belong in one of these fractional grids. But ultimately, fluid design is largely going to come down to making sure you don't use pixels as a unit. Another example of this, if we wanted our image here to behave responsively, we might choose to use a different unit on that. I can come down to my image. Right now I am floating the image so that it appears on the side. I might say, well, you know what? This isn't going to be 200 pixels. This will be 40% of the width. I make that one simple change, and now my image, if I refresh, is going to scale. 40% might have been a bit too much, but we never get to the point where it completely eclipses the paragraph. It'll grow and shrink here. We'll say maybe closer to 20% might be a little bit better for us. Now we've looked at fluid design. I want to look at another set of changes we could make here. So if you remember, on our MDN page, eventually the layout changed entirely. If we go back and look, an entire column disappeared. No amount of fancy use of units is going to make an entire column disappear. In order to do that, we're going to have to use a second technique called adaptive design. In adaptive design, we instead completely change the layout as our viewport changes. So in order to do this, we're going to use the @media rule in our style sheet. When I put @media, what I am telling my browser is, under some set of conditions, here's a set of style blocks I want to apply. It's almost like our @keyframes, where there is some contextual additional component here on top of whatever the CSS normal syntax is. So we're going to define all of our normal CSS blocks. Like, let's say I know I want to switch to a 2-column layout. Well, the CSS to do that, I would say I've got a main content area, and in my main content area, now instead of my grid template columns being 3 across, I'm going to have one on the right that takes up 1/4 of the space, and one on the left, or on the right, that takes up 3/4 of the space, and then this sidebar on the left that takes up 2/4 of the space. This means I'm going to have to redefine these template areas, and maybe this time I'll say, well, you know what? Now there's just going to be a header that stretches all the way across both columns, and now I've got the sidebar and the main text, and then below that I've got the ads, and the main text will continue. Now I've kind of visually laid out what I want this thing to look like with my new styles. To make sure this doesn't apply all the time, I'm going to wrap the entire thing in this media rule here. And what this media rule allows me to do is say the conditions under which this little guy here can apply. So there are a bunch of different things that you can put in the media rule. You can say, well, when it's displayed as a screen, when it's displayed as print, when it's actually printed out, you might change the colors, get rid of all of the extra large blocks of colored background, make sure you're not going to waste someone's entire ink cartridge. But the big one we're going to look at in this video is make an adjustment based on screen size. So in my @media rule, I'll say all of the things inside the media rule, so this main tag mainly, will only apply when the min width is 1000 pixels and the max width is 1400 pixels. So what I'm saying here is when the screen is not huge, if it's more than 1400, 3 columns is fine. But as soon as you hit 1400, I want to start conserving space. I've also set a minimum here, and you'll see why in just a second. That is because often when we're doing these responsive layouts, I want to have multiple stages of changes to my web page. If you remember, on MDN, first it shifted to 2 column, and then later it shifted to 1 column. I can do that by just adding a second media rule. I can say, well, you know what? From 1000 to 1400, here's what I want to look at. However, if you're under 1400, so if you're max, or if you're under 1000, so your max is 1000, then I'm going to cut even more. I'm going to say, well, now it's a 1 column layout. Now it's the header and then the sidebar and then the ads and then the main text, all straight up and down in one single row. Maybe at this point, I also decide, well, the width of this thing is now 95 view width. I want to suck up some of that white space on the sides. I can do all of that in this rule. And now if I go back over to my web page, if we refresh here, as I start shrinking this thing down, as soon as I get to less than 1000 pixels across, now I've got my table of contents up here and my little ad call out down here. If I keep shrinking it even further, now I've got my table of contents up top, our little ad call out, and then all of the content down below. And the big benefit of this is as we make this change, as we shrink down from a 3 column layout to a 2 column layout to a 1 column layout, we conserve all of the horizontal space, all of the width. We kind of get to keep much closer proportions to what we originally envisioned. I envisioned this paragraph would have so many words across. I kind of styled my image, assuming that I might need to eventually grow this image up, especially as I shrink it way down. But you can see, as we're doing this, the image has much more of a chance to stay legible, to stay a readable size, because it doesn't have to worry about a bunch of wasted space on the right and a bunch of wasted space on the left. So that is responsive design, sort of in a quick summary. This is not every technique you can use. There are definitely other things to think about. In general, the main considerations that will get you close enough are, first, when you are dealing with very vertical devices, things like a phone in a portrait configuration, you're going to have a very short compressed width. In those cases, you'll actually want to prefer a vertical layout, sort of like what we did here, where we didn't necessarily remove content. We just moved it so that it wasn't taking up as many different columns of space. When width is at a premium, you really want to effectively use that width and not waste an entire third of your page on just one little sidebar. So that is the first tip, is on width compressed devices, prefer vertical layouts. Next, when you have something that isn't a always required component, typically something that captures important user input like site navigation, you can actually use something modal to capture that. You can do something like what MDN did, where once it gets sufficiently small, now to navigate the site, you need to click a button, make a sliding sidebar either from the top or from the side, and have this be the only thing the user is focusing on. If you notice, they gray out the rest of their web page. They create a semi-transparent foreground and say, well, this is what you're working with right now. make your decision here, or they create something that it literally takes up the whole page once you expand this little toolbar. You can make a similar change in your code so that that content is just completely gone. It doesn't even need to take up a column or space on the top. Someone will have to actually click a button to make use of it. So modals, that's called making a modal when something kind of takes focus and you have to work on it. That is another great strategy for creating an adaptive layout. Finally, you also have to consider what your users are going to be using to interact with your page. With a mouse, we can make very fine, precise clicks. We can target exactly what we want. As you are designing things responsively, it might be worth considering, well, when my device has a coarse pointer, there's actually a media rule for pointer that lets you pick if it's coarse or fine. Or when my screen size is sufficiently small, I want to make sure certain controls, certain other aspects of my web page that require precise clicking, I might want to expand them out a bit, make radio buttons have a little bit more of padding, make inputs easier to tap on, make buttons larger. Controls like that need to be built with consideration for the type of device that your users are going to be using. And again, all of that can be done just with media rules and the normal CSS styling we've been using in this entire video series. So that is our attempt here at making a responsive web page. Hopefully you can incorporate these techniques in future designs. In our next video, we'll be looking at another accessibility consideration. We'll be looking at the syntax for ARIA, which is the accessibility rich API that the browser gives us for engaging with things like screen readers and textual assistants. So look forward to that video, and I will catch you all in the next one.